Alrighty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off this particular sort of webinar talking about the brain. And the reason why I want to do that is I want to give you guys a foundational understanding of how the brain operates. So once we've got a foundational understanding of how the brain operates, we'll then be in a better position to actually help ourselves essentially. So the brain is constituted of three parts. So we've got the brain stem, which is connected to the spinal cord. So that's responsible for all that involuntary sort of behaviors, physical sort of processes that take place in the body. So breathing, heart rate, for instance. So it's essentially the role of it is to keep you alive. Then on top of that, we've got another structure called the limbic system. So this limbic system is also nicknamed the security guard part of our brain. And the purpose of the limbic system is to actually enhance our safety. So anything that is good within the environment must be gotten and retrieved, and anything that is bad must be avoided or essentially sort of killed off. And it's very much connected to our senses and to our motor skills. So what the limbic system is doing is constantly sort of scanning threats within our environment. And then what it's doing is providing us feedback through our endocrine and hormonal systems of any threat that actually sort of exists, right? And it's constantly looking for anything dangerous within our environment. It's about 200 million years old. Then on top of that, we've got a structure called the neocortex. Now, the neocortex can also be referred to as the CEO part of our brain, and it's 100 million years old. And it's a thinking part of our brain. So it's that part of our brain that's getting us to engage in executive functioning, working memory, planning, decision-making, marrying ideas together, looking at long-term perspectives and short-term perspectives and putting them all together essentially. And really good for important for decision-making, of course, as well. So the security guard part of our brain, the limbic brain and the neocortex are in communication with each other. Now, during caveman times, the security guard part of our brain was really important in being able to detect predation, for instance, or warfare, bad weather, and it sends a message to our bodies that we either sort of need to run away, stay safe, or freeze. So it essentially operates to the flight, fright, and freeze sort of systems within our body. Alrighty. So as we progressed along the evolutionary line, the security guard part of our brain stayed to be sort of a very important thing, naturally sort of speaking. So anything in terms of the way of safety, so food, intimacy, sex, belonging, shelter, for instance. So anything that is good for us and is going to facilitate our survival, our security guard part of the brain is very much invested in having access to that and getting that for us. So anything that can endanger our survival in the way of rejection, for instance, or being shooed out of a group or not being made part of our group, that's what we call physical threats, and that's what we essentially sort of needed to avoid. So how does the security guard part of our brain communicate to us that there's a physical threat? So it senses it within the environment, there's constant vigilance of threat within the environment, and then through the hormonal and endocrine system, it sends a cascade of hormones. So it might be adrenaline, cortisol, and it's those hormones that get us prepared through the fight and freeze system in order to be able to combat the danger, right? So that's a really sort of simplistic way about thinking about it, but a true way nevertheless. And then we also have safety within our environment. So when the security guard part of our brain senses that there's safety within our environments, what it does, it sends hormones in the form of oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin to let us know that things are good. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that this works really well for physical threats within our environment, right? But the majority of threats that essentially sort of take place within our 21st century WEIRD societies, so well-developed Western sort of societies that are quite comfortable, and some Eastern societies, the problem with it is that the majority of threats are no longer physical, right? The majority of threats are essentially emotional or mental threats within the 21st sort of century. So what ends up happening is that we have a negative automatic thought that might sort of come up, right? That negative automatic thought is essentially associated with, so you might have the negative automatic thought of I'm a failure or I'm stupid, right? Usually what happens after you have that negative automatic thought is that you experience a cascade of chain reaction thoughts, and they usually occur as a result of our what if kind of thinking. So you have the negative automatic thought, very natural to sort of pop up, of coming in the form of I'm stupid. I'm stupid. That means I'm not going to be able to finish this degree, get this piece of paper, get this particular job, get this promotion. My supervisor, my boss is definitely going to fire me. Once they fire me, I won't have the finances to take care of the mortgage, won't be able to purchase this house, won't be able to look after my kids and family. I'm going to end up on the streets and I'm going to get sick. Essentially, that's the what if story that eventually sort of develops, and our security guard part of our brain perceives that story essentially as a threat. Now, our security guard part of our brain can't tell the difference between physical threats and mental and emotional threats. So it perceives the imagined as actually real. It perceives the imagined as real, even though it's actually sort of pretend and made up. So these mental threats can be in the form of, what happens if I get sick? What happens if my health deteriorates and I become reliant on the government? And they can also be in the positive form of, if I have enough friends, then I'm going to be safe and happy. If I say, for instance, am able to have a lot of money, then I'm going to be happy. If, say, for instance, I have lots of cars and lots of property, then I'm going to be in a good place. So all these mental threats are essentially occurring within the context of worries about our social status, our relationships, our careers, right? Many of which are actually sort of made up. Now, the security guard part of our brain can't tell the difference between these mental threats and these physical threats. So in response to physical threats, what is it doing? It's trying to actually sort of manage the problem and control the problem, and it does that really well. But in response to mental threats, it's also trying to control the situation. And we'll talk about the downside of that, trying to control the mental situation, similar in a manner to the physical sort of situation. So when it comes to that security guard part of our brain, usually the way it responds to the physical sort of situations, the CEO brain, the neocortex agrees with that. Okay, so the security guard part of our brain, it's constantly sort of building fences, building fortresses in response to danger. It's working through the fight and flight system, trying to sort of keep us safe, right? So it's very much working in the same way that a squirrel does, collecting acorns before the coming winter, right? CEO brain agrees with this approach, but by and large. So when there's a problem, say for instance, your car breaks down, what do the two parts of the brain do? Security guard part of our brain is getting us, for instance, to call the NRMA. We fear getting reprimanded at work, so we're calling the NRMA or whatever your insurance is. You're calling, you're taking the car to the mechanic. You're essentially hopping online if that doesn't work and finding a new car on Gumtree. So if there's another physical threat in the form of, say, for instance, you've got a broken leg. Say you've got a broken leg, what do you end up doing? You go to the doctor, you get it plastered, you go to the hospital, you do your physio sessions. A very good way of responding to sort of physical threats within our environment, okay? So that's not so much a very good way of dealing with the what-ifs of life, the mental threats that basically end up coming out. So in terms of the security guard part of our brain, it's very much connected to our senses and our motor skills. So what does that mean? If it's tightly connected to our senses and our motor skills from a neurobiological perspective, it means it's getting us to engage in shoot first, ask questions later, right? So say, for instance, security guard part of our brain is scanning our environment. There's a car that swerves by, or there's a spider web with a hideous spider sort of stuck in the middle of it. Essentially what you do, instinctively, the security guard part of our brain responds instinctively, swerves straight out of the way of that particular sort of threat, right? So it's shooting first, asking questions later, very functional from a survival sort of perspective, a survival point of view. It's keeping you sort of safe. So it's a technique, a skill of our body within our brain that works to keep us safe, and it's essentially there, so for very good reason. Now, it's not there for very good reason when it comes to our mental threats, because we don't want to be shooting first and asking questions later when it comes to our mental sort of threats, because those mental threats are pretend, they're not real. And when we're shooting first and asking questions later, we're doing things like fleeing from the threat. It might be, say, for instance, you're stressed, let's down a bottle of wine in order to numb it, in order to get rid of the stress, in order to avoid the stress, right? Say, for instance, You might be, sorry. This is the perks of working from home. So say, for instance, you might be, you've got a threat in front of you. It might be the case that, you know, you're trying to cope with the actual sort of situation. So you're trying to get rid of the situation. You're trying to actually sort of suppress the situation when there's a threat that comes by. So it's very much similar to what ends up happening with the security guard part of our brain, is that it sort of tries to hijack your sort of thinking. It tries to sort of hijack your sort of thoughts. So it might sort of give you the urge, in order, for instance, to yell at your husband or yell at your wife or yell at your boss, essentially. So when you're in that sort of state of wanting to yell at them, that's a security guard part of the brain sort of trying to get out of the situation. So you're arguing, you're fighting that actual sort of situation. You might be, say, for instance, it's very much akin to what ends up happening with the security guard part of the brain. You also might get you to actually sort of suppress the situation, right? So it's very much akin to, you know, trying to get rid of a particular sort of thought. So that thought might be, you know, it might be, so for instance, I'm stupid, this sort of situation sort of needs to stop. What ends up happening is that it's very similar to the not thinking about that bear, that pink bear within the room. So when you're anxious, all you're going to be able to do is think about that pink bear within the room. So it's going to be sort of flashing out, flashing out, flashing out. It becomes ever more activated within your mind. So when when you've got a thought that's considered to be sort of threatening, like, oh, you know, I shouldn't be thinking about this person. I shouldn't be thinking about the situation. I need to suppress this situation. I need to go to get rid of the situation. It's very much akin to, you know, trying to get rid of that pink bear in the room and not thinking about it. It's analogous sort of to that. And all that ends up happening is that you try to sort of suppress it, and then all that ends up happening is that it becomes more activated, essentially, so within your mind. And so what ends up happening in this particular situation is that the CEO part of the brain sort of might try to sort of get you to not respond to that particular threat. So say the person sort of coming, you know, arguing with someone, by diverting you from that. So, hey, no, you shouldn't argue with this person. You shouldn't yell at your wife. You shouldn't yell at your husband or your boss. But when the security guard part of the brain is pretty much invested in trying to control the situation, and the way in which it tries to control the situation is by coping with it in a really sort of unhelpful way. You might say, for instance, try to ruminate. You might get you to sort of worry about that sort of particular situation. So that's the way in which you sort of try to fight that essential sort of threat. That's the way in which the threat is basically sort of fought off. And all that is analogous to is digging sand within a hole. You think that the more that you dig within that hole, the more that you're actually sort of going to get yourself out of the hole. But all that rumination suppression is actually sort of doing is creating a bigger hole and making it more difficult for you to actually sort of get out of that hole. And that's what's happening when you're shooting first and asking sort of questions later. You find yourself sort of caught in the habit of actual sort of trying to protect yourself, essentially. So what's happening is that when you're shooting first, asking questions later, you're giving more saying power to the security guard part of the brain, and you are becoming less involved, and that is causing you to maintain particular sort of types of habits that are not useful. And then we end up constantly sort of asking ourselves, what's actually sort of going on? What's actually going on? And it's that commonsensical part of your brain that's asking yourself what's actually sort of going on. That's the CEO part of your brain, but it's essentially sort of being hijacked by the security guard part of your brain. So if I can give you another example, it's very much akin, say, for instance, if you're procrastinating. There might be sort of a task that you need to sort of get done. It might be a work-related task or a university-related task or assignment. Security guard part of the brain says, oh, I can't do this task. I'm going to fail, for instance. This task is too much. If I can't get this task done perfectly, then I'm never going to be able to sort of get this task done. I don't want to do it. Security guard part of the brain jumps in. It gets you to fight from the situation or to flee from that situation or to avoid it. So fleeing it might be, so for instance, avoiding the task, procrastinating. Essentially freezing from that situation might be sort of just shutting down, going to sleep, essentially. So what's happening is that if that happens often enough, what ends up happening is that it becomes a habit. So you find yourself sort of caught within this habit of essentially sort of procrastinating. And that's the security guard part of the brain trying to control the situation. It's kind of trying to control this particular sort of mental threat. And then the neocortex is going on, what's happening here? You need to get these tasks done, essentially. So that's essentially what happens when the security guard part of the brain is shooting first, asking questions later. So What's the problem with all of this? Okay, so why is it that our security guard part of the brain is pretty much invested in shooting first, asking questions later, right? Part of the problem is maintained by the fact that we've learned to turn actual experience into words. Now, words are obviously sort of a good thing. They're necessary, they help us to describe everything. But the problem is that we've used them as principles in order to describe everything, right? So they're good in order to describe certain things, but we've used them as principles to describe everything. So we use them to describe our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts. Now, our thoughts are essentially made up of internal words that ramble through our brain like lightning speed, right? And our thoughts and our words have very much similar sort of symbolic value. And it's those thoughts that are rambling through our brain that are the stories. They're the stories that emerge as a result of the what ifs that cascade. So from that negative automatic thought that actually sort of ends up emerging. And it's those stories that essentially produce certain images and pictures within our brain, and they create through our hormonal sort of systems certain physical sensations of increased heart rate, increased breathing, for instance. And then that can cause us to feel really negative. So that can cause us to sort of feel really sort of bad. And then the way in which our security guard part of the brain tries to control the situation is to say suppress or try and avoid those particular sort of thoughts. So you might sort of start to have thoughts along the lines of, you know, I shouldn't think about that, so forget about that, so forget about that, right? So and the reason why the words are essentially a problem that constitute these particular thoughts is because the words, we've attached meaning to those particular words that then generate the stories. So it's very much similar to someone, say, putting a gun to your head and saying to you, I'm going to shoot you. You shouldn't be afraid. If you're afraid, I'm actually going to end up shooting you. So what ends up happening is that, naturally speaking, you're going to be afraid, right? So that's the normal reaction to have. And that's the idea that we essentially have in our heads, that you will be afraid and that you're not going to be able to control the internal mechanisms within your head. And those thoughts are going to continue to ramble on and ramble on. And you're still going to try and maintain that level of control, essentially. So security guard part of the brain, it sees the mental threat, okay, it tries to control the mental threat, it produces feelings of being, you're going to start to sort of feel afraid, and the security guard part of the brain is really afraid. It wants to control those mental threats, but the more that it tries to control, the more that the problem sort of just proliferates itself. So what do? What you need to do is to stop assigning meaning to words, because it's the meaning that you assign to these words that are generating the stories that you're essentially sort of creating, that the security guard part of the brain is essentially sort of trying to control, right? So we need to assign less meaning to words. We're not ignoring the words, but we're putting less emphasis on these actual sort of words. We want to take the words less seriously, those words that are rambling on in our brains. And once we assign less meaning to those words, our brain starts to see sort of less threat, right? And then the security guard part of our brain that's being reinforced becomes less reinforced, it becomes less angry. So let's look at a specific example. Now, Levantine Arabic is the only other language that I know, but feel free to use this with any other language. It can be Polish or French or Greek or whatever it is. But a quick lesson in Levantine Arabic. So the word hub in Levantine Arabic means love, and the word ikra, which hasn't been spelled correctly here, means hate. Okay, so now if you don't know Arabic, you're just going to see these words as scribbles in space. Okay, so the words hub and ikra, if you don't speak Arabic, essentially, they're not going to have any meaning to you. But that's exactly what our brain does. Our brain is assigning meaning to these particular words that start to become a representation of the actual event, regardless of whether the actual event is actually sort of taking place. So by you giving context to these particular words, you start to get a particular reaction of that word in your brain and in your body. That offsets the security guard part of the brain because it's seeing meaning attached to those particular sort of words that eventually sort of come up, and it starts to ramble on and on. So most of the thoughts that we're having are essentially sort of stories, their opinions, their beliefs, their ideas, their biases, their models, right? Some of them are true. Some of them are grounded in fact. Some of them are just opinions. Many of them are stories that we tell about ourselves, our lives, our futures, you and I, okay? So they don't actually have to do much with the actual event. And that becomes a problem when we start to actually sort of fuse with these particular sort of stories. We fuse with the story and it becomes our reality. And we use it in order to predict our future. So if you tell yourself, I'm not motivated, right? That starts to have an impact on the way that you feel. You start to feel sort of down, you start to feel sort of depressed, right? So that's what's happening. That causes, so you're having that thought, I'm not motivated, sends a message to your security guard part of your brain that you need to shut down, you need to freeze, essentially, okay? That's causing you to sort of start to feel sort of down, depressed. It's causing you to want to sort of shut down. And then if you say that to yourself, a certain amount of times, you eventually start to believe it. It becomes hardwired, which is why it's very important to note that whatever we essentially end up enunciating on our tongue actually has a lot of power. There's a lot of power behind actually sort of saying and enunciating these mental threats that actually sort of come to mind because they become hardwired. We start to believe them. We start to predict our future on the basis of these particular thoughts. I'm not motivated now. I'm not feeling motivated now in my work. That means I'm not going to feel motivated in any aspect of my life, including sport or starting a broader sort of career or my intellectual sort of pursuits. That's who I am. You're fused with that particular story. You've assigned a truth value to that particular sort of story, and then you sort of start to live by it. So the words and the phrases and the thoughts that come up do have a big effect. So saying to yourself, I'm hopeless, that's going to start to generate feelings of, hey, I feel bad. If you say to yourself, however, on the flip side, I'm awesome, I'm lovable, I'm a great person, that can get you to sort of start to feel a bit better about yourself, but not if it's taking place within the context of, hey, I don't even believe this within the first place. So what do you do about all of this, right? So if we're assigning meaning to words, and these words are making up our thoughts, and these thoughts are generating the stories, and our security guard part of the brain is seeing that as a threat, what do we need to, and we're fused with it, and we see it as our reality because our brains can't tell the difference between physical threats and mental threats, and we see it as truth, what do we need to do? We need to diffuse from these particular sort of thoughts. So instead of saying, I'm not good enough, you say, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough. You stick that in front of I'm not good enough. And what that allows you to do is to realize that you are not your thoughts. You're actually sort of separate from the reality of your thoughts. That's one technique that you can try. The second technique that you try is an attitude of gratitude, and that's literally thanking your mind. So it may be the case of, I'm a failure. Thanks, mind. And what that does, I know it sounds a bit frivolous, but what it does is that it helps to loosen up the energy and the level of seriousness that you have around that particular sort of thought, right? So it helps, if you do it in a humorous, tongue-in-cheek way, it loosens up that sense of seriousness that you have around that thought. So you're in a better position to essentially distance yourself from that thought, diffuse from that thought, recognize that it doesn't have to carry that much meaning. So if you have the thought, I'm a failure, it's pretty much the same as having the thought, I'm a strawberry, right? Because the thought of I'm a failure isn't actually sort of really true because it's not taking into account your multiplicity of successes when thinking about your actual sort of resources and skills, as well as areas of improvement, which, by the way, aren't stagnated, have the capacity to actually sort of change over time and become strengths. So essentially just recognizing that calling yourself a mango is similar sort of to, I'm a failure. There isn't much of a difference. There's no real truth to one or the other. So when you do find yourself ruminating and having that story within your mind, thanking your mind, or even having this attitude of gratitude sort of story approach to these thoughts. Okay, I'm having the I'm not a good friend today thought, or I'm having the I'm not good enough sort of story, right? So just thanking your mind for sharing. The third thing that you can try is recognize that thoughts are not actually sort of causes. So just because I'm feeling upset, it doesn't mean that I have to behave in a manner that is in line with that. It doesn't mean I have to shout out and yell as a security guard part of the brain. Shoot first, asking questions later is getting you to do. Just because I'm upset, it doesn't mean I can't have a cool, rational conversation with my boss. Just because I'm nervous, it doesn't mean I can't do a public speaking gig. Just because I'm angry, it doesn't mean I have to lash out at the person in front of me. It doesn't mean that I'm not capable of having a calm conversation with my husband or my wife or my boss or my mother or whoever it actually sort of might be. So saying to yourself, these thoughts are not causes, and I'm still perfectly capable of behaving. I may feel like this on the inside, but I'm capable of behaving in spite of these particular thoughts. And the fourth technique in response to the fact that we attach meaning to words is to let it rain. So recognize, what's rolling on in your brain. Recognize it's an incompetent story. Stop the story. Allow the experience to be there. Realize that this is just a story amongst story, an experience amongst experiences, a thought amongst a cascade of thoughts that pass through your mental and emotional being and through your body throughout your life. It's just lyrics in a radio that can be true or not. Investigate with kindness and compassion. So, for instance, kindness and compassion is better than having an approach of judgment to those particular thoughts, because when you judging, you become fused with those particular thoughts. So you do it in a compassionate way, recognizing that you can observe that thought, you can let it go. When you're compassionate, you're in a better position to see the thought come back. If you're judgmental about it, you become agitated when the thought actually sort of comes back. You're fused with it, you're less in a better position to actually sort of let it go. And then natural awareness. So N for natural awareness, to say, I'm feeling this, I may have good reason for feeling this, but I'm not going to allow this particular thought to get caught up with me. I'm going to act differently. I'm not going to get caught up with this particular thought, and it's not going to be a cause for me to behave in an unhelpful way. And then those are essentially some 4 good ways in order to actually sort of deal with these mental sort of threats, recognizing that these are sort of mental threats. They're not necessarily, so this is a good way for the security guard part of the brain in order to respond to these particular sort of mental threats. So, and it's good because you recognize that these words are just words. They don't necessarily, you don't have to sort of attach meaning to these particular words, and the meaning that you attach to these particular words aren't a reflection of reality. So those techniques allow you to diffuse from it and recognize that these particular thoughts aren't actually sort of truth.